So you'd like to knit a pair of socks from the toe to the cuff, but you're not sure where to start. I've got you covered in this tutorial. We're going to knit a pair of toe-up socks using double pointed needles. You'll just need some sock yarn, your DPNs, and the pattern, which you'll find linked down below. So let's go knit some toe-up socks. Hey nerdy knitter, Tanya here. It's all about toe-up sock construction, specifically on double pointed needles. So you're going to need your needles and your yarn. We'll go over all of the supplies in a second. Now the sock itself starts with a closed center cast on, then we'll work a spiral toe, and then a plain stockinette foot, and then a classic heel flap and gusset just in stockinette stitch as well, so you can get the construction down really well, but of course you can put it in a heel flap pattern if you want to. And then finishing with a simple rib. Really simple socks and not that difficult to do. We're going to walk through each of the steps and you can follow along with me with the pattern. You'll find it linked down below. Comes in 11 sizes from a small tiny sock all the way up to a large adult male size. So click down below, get that pattern, and then follow along with me. So let's get started. Now before we actually look at this sock and its construction, let's look at what we're going to need. First of all, you're going to need some yarn. In my case, I'm using this lovely self-striping yarn. This is Biscot Yarns. It's their Yarn of the Month Club, one of the colorways for that. It's an 85% superwash merino and 15% nylon. Comes in this really fun self-striping color. And along with your yarn, you're going to need like, well, 100 gram skein, 400 yards or thereabouts. It really depends on the size of your foot and how long the leg is on the sock. You might need more than that, but 100 gram skein is usually plenty for most socks, except for very large sizes. You're also going to need some double pointed needles, US 1 or 2.25 millimeter. A set of 5 is ideal. I actually have a set of 5, but I bent one, so I had to find an extra one to put with the set that I'm using. So you can use 4 if you want, but for the toe especially, and then part of the heel, it's better to have 5 needles, and you'll see as we work why I request that you use 5. You're also going to need just a few stitch markers, one for marking the beginning of the round, and then 2 more when we're working our gusset and heel. And of course, a tapestry needle when we have to weave in the ends. Before we cast on, let's just take a quick look at our sock. So we are working toe up on double pointed needles, and we're starting right down here with a closed cast on. And this swirly toe, you can see it's got 4 increase points right there. We're going to be using yarn overs for those, and the closed cast on we're using is actually very simple. We're going to start with that, of course. So after the toe, we're working the leg or the foot of the sock in stockinette stitch. Then we start increasing for our gusset right here, and then when we have all the stitches we need, we start our heel turn. We just have a round heel. We're using German short rows to make our heel, and then when the heel is complete, we decrease the stitches at both sides, those gusset stitches, and create our heel flap at the same time, which I've also just done in stockinette. On that you can also do, if you like to do like some sort of an eye of partridge or some sort of a heel flap slip stitch pattern, then you can do that there as well. And then the leg of the sock, I just like shorty socks, so I just did just a few rounds right here, and then finishing off with 1 by 1 rib at the top and Jenny's surprisingly stretchy bind off to give us a nice stretchy edge. So we're going to talk about all of those techniques and of course knitting on double pointed needles as we knit this sock. So let's start by casting on, and this is the simplest of simple cast-ons, but I will say it's very fiddly, but pretty much any toe-up sock cast-on is going to be a little fiddly. We're starting with just 8 stitches for all sizes. No matter what size you're knitting, you're going to start with 8 stitches, and we're using just the backwards loop cast-on. Now, if you prefer a closed cast-on like Judy's Magic cast-on, the Turkish cast on, or the figure 8 cast on, you can certainly use one of those, but I just wanted to demonstrate a super simple cast on. You're just going to use backwards loop cast on, or I mean, if you could refer to it as the half hitch cast on, the E-loop cast on. There's other names for it, but we're just going to make some loops on our knitting needle and just get started. So I have the tail of yarn here, and it's sort of draped over my hand, and I've got my empty needle here. And what I'm going to do is just make some simple loops with my thumb. I'm going to go down and towards my body and make a loop, and then put my needle in that, And it's really just a loop at this point. It could fall right off, but I'm just sort of holding it in place. I'm going to do that again. Thumb, scoop towards me, make a loop, put that on the needle. I'm going to do this 4 times. Down, towards me, put the loop on the needle, and loop on the needle. And there we have 4. And we want to put 4 more on another needle. Now you could put all 8 on one and then slide them over, but it's just as easy to put them right on this one too. So I'm holding it together with this needle. Take my tail of yarn, scoop, put that stitch on. I'm going to tighten that one up. There's 2, 3, and 4. Now we want to rotate things slightly because we are going to be working in the round, and right now all our stitches are going in one direction. So I'm going to flip this one over, and my tail is now down here out of the way. So it looks a bit fiddly. It is very fiddly at this point. There's just no getting around that. So we're just going to make sure everything's in the right position. We've got our stitches like this. They're connected on that side. Our yarn tail is back here. And there, it might be a long strand between. It's okay. We can close this up. Even when we're done, we can take that tail of yarn and close up the very center of that anyway. So now we're going to take a 3rd needle. We're not going to divide these up yet between like 3 or 4 needles. There's just too few stitches. So we're going to just slide things up a little bit and get our tail of yarn. Now this first round, we're just going to join in the round right here and work around these 8 stitches. That's all we're going to do, just to sort of get things moving a little bit. So we've got more than just this very simple cast on, because this cast on can just fall apart very easily. So, but for our purposes, it is actually working out really well because we just want something simple that's not going to leave a big seam line at the bottom of our toe. So the yarn and working yarn's in the back, and we want to join it to this front, the stitches on the front. So I'm just going to slide things up, and we're just going to knit across. And like I said, this is very fiddly, and if your yarn can split, mine is a bit splitty, then that just makes it a little more fiddly. But just do your best, and if you try and you don't like this one, then just go right ahead and use like the Turkish cast on or Judy's Magic cast on, any of those. Just start with your 8 stitches and do this same thing. So we're just going to join in the round and knit these 4 stitches. So there's the first 4. So I'm just going to slide them up, and I'm going to turn this over, and we want to repeat that for these 4 stitches. Now there we go. We finished that very first fiddly round. Now we can turn our work again. There, and we have made our little tiny closed cast on. Now of course there might be a little hole there. That is totally fine. When we are done our sock, we can take the tail and close things up a little bit. But now we're going to start increasing and actually shaping our toe. And we're going to be using yarn overs for this. So make sure you're grabbing your tail of yarn. Now at this point we're still just working on 2 needles just because there's so few stitches. I don't want to divide them yet, but we're going to do that on the very next round. But first we're going to add a few more stitches. So the yarn's in the back needle back here, and we're going to knit across the stitches on this needle. So our increase round right now is yarn over. So for a yarn over at the beginning of the round, I'm just going to sort of hold the yarn over my needle like that, and then knit 2 stitches. And then repeat that again. Yarn over and knit 2. we're adding 4 stitches. We'll have 12 stitches when we're done, and then we can divide these between a few more needles. Okay, so slide them up, turn, and we'll repeat that. So I'm going to show you in my right hand because the yarn overs can be a bit different too with this hand. So basically we need a yarn over before we work this first stitch. So I'm going to put the needle in front, or the yarn in front of my needle, and then bring it over the needle. So when I make my first stitch, and I'm going to use my thumb to hold that yarn there so I don't lose that yarn over. So I would insert and knit that stitch. Oops, let's try that again. The yarn's in front of my needle, so when I bring it around, the yarn over is there while I'm working this stitch. Knit one more. And then do that again. Bring the yarn to the front. So when I go to make this stitch, the yarn is in the front and I bring it around, and that creates the yarn over at the same time as knitting that stitch. So now we have 12 stitches, and on this next round we're going to divide them up between our needles. Okay, so the fiddliest bit is now out of the way. We've got some stitches on here. So now let's get working on dividing these up and continuing increasing for our toe. Okay, so we're on round 2, and we're going to introduce the rest of our needles. We want to divide our toe into 4 sections. It's just easier. That way we have 4 increases, and that way whenever we move to a new needle, we're just going to increase on that needle. So on this round 2, your instructions will tell you you're going to adjust your stitches over 4 needles. So we're going to start by working a yarn over. So if I had this in my right hand, I'm going to make sure the yarn's in the front of my needle. Move my stitches up. Don't drop them off though. So the yarn's in the front because it's going to make that first yarn over. And my first stitch on here is the yarn over from the previous round. So what I want to do is knit that through the back loop. So the yarn's in the front to make my first yarn over, but I'm going to work into the back of this stitch to close that yarn over. So I've created a new stitch and I'm closing up that other increase, and then I'm going to knit 2. Now I'm going to repeat that until I have done that 4 times. So I'm going to take another needle. Now we're introducing a new one. And I'm going to switch back to my left hand. It's just easier for me, but hopefully if you're right-handed, that's what you're going to do. That yarn's in the front while you're making, holding that in place to make your yarn over. Now for the left, I just do the same. I make sure my needle's underneath and the yarn is on the top. And I'm going to come into this first stitch is my yarn over. So I'm going to come into there from the back. If I have to, I sort of bring it over the top and then to the back, just so I'm not splitting that stitch. Gonna knit that yarn over. We're knitting it through the back to close it up so it'll twist close so we don't have a hole. And then knitting 2. There's my next section. Now we can go on to number 3. So yarn over, knit that yarn over through the back loop. Trying not to split that stitch. There we go. Knit 2. And one more time. So I'm going to take, it's from a different needle set, but I just have to use what I've got. All right, so I'm going to yarn over again. Knit that yarn over through the back loop, and then knit 2. Okay, so now we are set up, and we have our little closed cast on. We've started our increases You can see there's our yarn tail right there. We can use that to close this all up later on. So now we're just going to continue increasing to create the very bottom, the tip of our sock right there. So now we're ready to move on and continue increasing. At this point, if you wanted to, you can use a stitch marker to mark that beginning of round. It's still a bit fiddly right now, but basically where that yarn tail is, that's where your beginning of round is. So I'm going to put my marker in there just so I know which needle is my beginning of round. Now, some sizes are going to move on to part 2, where you'll be alternating between increase rounds and plain knit rounds, but the larger sizes are going to continue this round that we just finished. Round 2, we're going to do that a few more times. So refer to the pattern and follow the instructions whether you have to move on or not, depending on your size. So I'm going to look for my working yarn, get myself sorted, and make some more stitches. The more stitches we get, the less fiddly this will be. So find out where I am next. Right here. So we're going to work that increase round again. So just get yourself set up as best you can. I know at this point there's not much we can do. A closed cast on with just a few stitches is just going to be fiddly. Can't be helped. Toe-up socks have their own pros and cons, same as cuff down. So we're going to continue. I'm going to do that round again where I'm making a yarn over, knitting the previous yarn over through the back loop, and then knitting to the end of this needle, which is now knit 3. And I find it helps to put the needle I'm working on should be on top of the other 2 needles. Those are underneath. The needle I'm working on is sitting on top. Just makes it a little less fiddly. So yarn over, knit that yarn over through the back loop, and knit to the end of this needle. Okay, so I'm back to the beginning of round. I should have 5 stitches on each needle at this point. At this point, a few more of the sizes will move on to step 2, and the last 4 sizes are going to repeat this one more time until you have 24 stitches. And I'm knitting a sock that has 72 stitches. That's my goal, is to get to 72. So I'm going to repeat this round once more, and I'll have 24 stitches. So I've worked my final increase round. Now I can move on to part 2. So all of the sizes will now be on this part 2, which means we're just going to have a plain knit round. We're going to knit that yarn over through the back loop, and then knit to the end of the round. And repeat that for the next needle. Knit the yarn over through the back loop, knit to the, not the end of the round, the end of the needle, and you just repeat that 4 times all together because we have 4 increases on every increase round. And one more time. So I chose yarn overs as the increase because for such a small number of stitches, I thought it was just going to be easier than trying to work a make one or something like that. But if you want to switch and use a different increase, then feel free. It's totally not a problem. Use whatever increase you want to use. Okay, so there is our plain round where we're just knitting that yarn over through the back loop, and all that's doing is closing that yarn over. We're twisting it close. We don't want to have an eyelet on our sock toe. So you can see the increased line right here, but we're twisting those yarn overs closed so we don't have big eyelet holes in our sock. Now our next round is our increase round. So all we're going to do on this round is add 4 yarn overs, 1 on each needle. So get yourself in position. I like to put the needle I'm working on top. So yarn over, whether you're holding it in the right or the left, you're just going to make sure the yarn's in the front of that needle and knit to the end of the needle. And repeat that 3 more times for a total of 4 yarn overs distributed around your sock toe. I like to move that needle underneath and turn, and the needle I'm working on is sitting on top of the other needles. It just feels a little easier that way when you've got so many needles flying around here. So yarn over, knit to the end of that needle. So we're just going to continue repeating these 2 rounds until you get to the number of stitches that you need for your sock size. And it's easy to tell where the beginning of round is. You either have a yarn over or you're closing up a yarn over. I don't have a yarn over here, so I know I'm going to be making one. So there's my yarn over and the end of the round, and now I will work my knit round. I see this needle has a yarn over, so I'm going to knit that yarn over through the back loop and knit to the end of this needle, and then just continue repeating these 2 rounds, making yarn overs and closing them up on the plain knit round until you get to your stitch count. And for me that is 72 stitches. So of course 72 total, not on each needle. So I think that's 18 stitches per needle in my case. So I'm just going to continue working these rounds, and you can continue as well until your sock is the circumference that you want and you've completed all of the toe shaping. So once that's done, you will have this really pretty, doesn't seem like much right now, but you can see the beginning of that spiral shaping in there, like you can see on our sock here. So we've divided that up. So we have this spiral that is formed by working those increases, one at the beginning of each needle. Now I will have a little tip right here. Let's say you don't like working on 4 and you just want to work on 3 needles and use your 4th, then just take a stitch marker, and as you're finishing that first needle, say I have to close up this stitch, I would stop when I get to the last stitch, put a marker on there, and then I can do the next needle, and I could combine 2 needles or 2 increase sections onto 1 needle. But if you do that, just pay attention to where that marker is. You're going to want to do an increase there, because we need to have our 4 increase points. So if you just don't want to work with this setup and you'd rather have 3 needles, then that's definitely possible, but the pattern is written to have 4 needles. So you'll just have to pay attention. You'll have to place that marker and then pay attention to that increase point so you don't forget to place your increase there. But you're going to just continue working those 2 rounds until you are at the full circumference that you want for your sock. I have 1 more round to do, but I want to move my marker up so it's a little closer to where I'm actually working, because now that tail is harder to tell where the beginning of round is. So I'm just going to move this up and work my final increase round. So I finished all of my increases. My toe is finished. I've got 18 stitches on each needle, so I've got 72 stitches now. You're going to follow the instructions for your size, repeating those increases as many times as you need. And now I have 1 more repeat of round 3 where I just have to work those yarn overs through the back loop to resolve them, and then we'll just get started on the foot. I've finished my repeat of round 3. I'm up to my stitch count that I need, and now I want to get all of my instep stitches on one needle, and then I'm going to keep the heel stitches on these 2 needles. Of course, if you want to continue working with 4 needles and then knitting with the 5th, that's perfectly fine. I've written the pattern to adjust the instep stitches to 1 needle. So you'll just have to make note of that as you're working. And I have my marker marking the beginning of round, but I actually like to use a small one of these little ring markers because now we're going to knit the length of the foot, and I want to make sure I'm knitting both of my socks to the same length. So I'm just going to slide it under the stitch that's right underneath my needle. So from this point on, I can keep track of the rounds in the length of the foot. So we're going to continue working in stockinette stitch. In my sock size, I have to knit until the foot length is 5 inches less than the total length I want. So I will just keep doing that. I can't remember how many rounds I had in this sock. I'll have to check my notes to make sure I knit the same number of rounds on this one, but I like to put a marker there so I know where I start counting those rounds from, because now my toe is finished. So I'm going to put all of my instep stitches on one needle now and get rid of this extra one that I'm using here. But when I'm knitting, now that I'm finished with all of those yarn overs, but when I was doing those, I liked this needle sitting on top so I could make that yarn over. But now, while I'm working just in stockinette stitch, I like the needle that's in my right hand. I like that one still to sit above the needles to either side. But my working needle, I keep underneath. And I'm not sure why this works for me, but by holding it here underneath and starting and keeping these first 2 stitches firm, I don't end up with any sort of ladders right there between the needles. So if you have a problem with ladders, then you can just try this. It's just simply where I'm holding that needle. My working needle is underneath this needle here, but the needle in my right hand is sitting on top of both of those needles. For some reason that works. I don't have to do anything else to avoid getting ladders at those joins where those 2 needles meet. But for some reason, I mean, this just seems to work for me. It's a very simple thing. I don't know quite why it works. So I'm going to get rid of this one now. I'm not going to use that one anymore. I'm going to continue knitting across this needle here as well. And then I like to put that needle underneath because I've just finished with it, so it's underneath now, and then I can turn. So at this point, all of my instep stitches are on one needle, and then the heel is divided between these 2. That's going to just get us set up for when we have to start increasing for our gusset, because we'll be increasing at these 2 points on these needles. So you want to just get yourself situated. You can continue using 4 needles and knitting with the 5th if you want. Just make note of that. Mark where you are on that first round so you can keep track of how many rounds you have to knit for the length of your foot. You can refer to the pattern, like depending on whatever size you're knitting, it will tell you exactly how long you should knit the foot, or how many inches or centimeters less than the total length you should knit, because then we have to start increasing for our gusset. So I finished knitting the length of the foot that I need, and it certainly doesn't look like much right now, but as you can see here, there's my gusset line. That's where I'm starting the gusset. So the actual length of the sock is not super long at this point, because I'm going to be adding, goodness, like half of the length just with the heel, the gusset and that heel turn. So depending on your sock size, you'll follow the instructions for the length or the sock size you're knitting, and the length is completely customizable. So it depends on the person who'll be wearing the sock how long it needs to be. So you can measure their foot and use that as a guide. So we're going to start here now on this gusset, just adding some increases. It's very, very simple. So our sock right now looks like this. We're at the beginning of our round. Can now remove that marker that was marking the length for the legs, or the length for the foot, I should say. I don't need that anymore. And I'm going to move my beginning of round marker closer to my needle so I can keep track of that. So the beginning of round is right here at the beginning of the instep. So what we're going to do is just keep knitting on the top stitches, this instep stitch, right, those stitches right there. And then when we turn and we knit across these 2 needles, we're going to make an increase on this edge and on this edge, and that's going to give us these increases on both edges right here, so we can get a lot more heel stitches. So we'll have stitches for our heel turn and our heel flap to make more space along this part of the sock, along that instep right there. So it's very simple to do this part. This is the next part. We're moving on from the foot onto the gusset. We're just going to knit our instep stitches, and now we can work our first increase. So we'll have an increase on each side of the heel for our gusset. So knit one and then make one right. So pick up that bar between the stitch here and the just worked stitch, lift it up onto our left needle so it's leaning towards the right, and I have to give it a tug to pull some of that excess to the front and knit into it to twist it closed. And then we're going to knit to the end of this needle, and to work the next one we're going to knit to the last stitch on needle 3 and work our left leaning increase. So here's my final stitch. I'll pick up that running bar between the two stitches, lift it up onto my left needle, but this time it's leaning off to the left, and I'll knit it through the back loop. That's a make one left. So that is our gusset, our increase round, and then round 2 is just simply knit all the way around, and you repeat those 2 rounds, increasing 2 stitches until you have the stitch count you need, and that's all spelled out in the pattern. I'm going to keep repeating that until I have 100 stitches all together. And then the pattern even tells you how many stitches you'll have on each needle, so you don't have to keep continuing to count everything. You can just count the stitches on the heel, because your instep stitches are going to remain exactly the same. So just keep repeating those 2 rounds, and then we'll come back and we'll work on our heel turn once we have enough stitches for the gusset. I've finished increasing for my gusset. You can see the stitches right there, and on this side of the heel right here. And we haven't touched our instep stitches. Now we're going to move on to creating our heel turn. This bottom part right here, we're going to use some German short rows to create this round heel shape. So we'll go from moving in this direction to moving in that direction. So our heel turn will help us turn the heel and start the leg of the sock. Now before we do that, we need to redistribute our stitches, because we have to work just back and forth just on the heel itself and not all of these gusset stitches or the instep stitches. So we're going to take 2 rounds to readjust everything. So we're going to need that extra needle again until we get ourselves situated. So with this first setup round, and this is all spelled out in the pattern as well, we're going to work half of our instep stitches with this needle. So in my case, that's 18 stitches. So I'm at the beginning of my round again, and I'm just going to knit half my instep stitches onto this needle. Okay, there's half. I'm going to stop right there. Now I need my extra needle now because I need all 5. And I'm going to work the other half of my instep stitches. Now I don't need this needle just quite yet. What I'm going to do is take the gusset stitches that I've just created, put them on this needle with this half of the instep. We don't need these gusset stitches while we're working our heel turns. We just want to get them out of the way. So I'm going to place a marker on there to separate my instep from my gusset. And in my case, I have 14 gusset stitches. So I'm going to knit 14 of the stitches from here. And of course, this is all spelled out in the pattern, how many stitches you need to knit. Okay, so this needle is all set. I've got half my instep, this marker, and then the gusset stitches for this side of the sock. And now I'm going to put I'm going back to this needle now, the empty one, and I'm going to get all of my heel stitches. So I need 18 stitches from this needle, and then 18 stitches from this needle. And I'm going to get them all on one needle because those are the stitches we're going to be working on. So depending on your stitch count, it's basically the original stitch count, but half of it, because that would be your original heel stitches. So I've got half of my stitches. I'm going to drop this needle for now and get the other half. I need 18 more stitches from this needle. Okay, so I've finished. My heel is all on this needle now, and I still have to finish knitting around, and these are just my remaining gusset stitches. So I'm just going to knit those onto this 4th needle. So at this point, this is what it looks like. It's just a bit of a mess. We're going to work one more setup round to get things situated and get over here so we can start working on our heel. So here's our beginning of round right here. There's half our instep stitches right there, and then the other half with the gusset stitches, and our heel stitches are all on this needle and the remaining gusset stitches here. So in this final setup round, we're going to get these gusset stitches and these instep stitches together, and then just work across and work to the end, but then we're going to stop and start working back and forth on this needle. So I'm going to put this needle down right now. We're going to get these instep stitches over here on these gusset stitches. So with that right needle, you're going to place your marker to separate your gusset stitches from those instep stitches, and then just knit across the stitches on needle 1 with this right needle. And then now we're in the setup that we want, but we need to get to our heel stitches now. So we've worked across the gusset and the instep, and we're going to finish working across this instep and gusset section. Now the last thing to do for our setup round 2 is to knit across our heel stitches. Now we're back down to just needing 4 needles, so I'm going to drop that spare one that I have and go back to the one that's part of this set. So technically the beginning of the round is here, but we're not going to knit all the way to this point. We're going to stop. When we get to the end of needle 3, we're going to stop right here. We're going to start working back and forth in rows just on the stitches here to create that turn on the heel. So these stitches up here are just going to be hanging out while we work on the stitches down here. So I've worked to the end of needle 3. I'm going to stop. We're going to go back and forth. We're going to use German short rows. I'm going to move this needle so it's sitting on top of the other 2, because we're not going to be bothering with these 2 needles here with our instep and gusset. We're just going to be working back and forth. So we're using German short rows, and I'll show you how to work those. But basically what's going to happen here is we're going to make a German short row here and purl all the way to the end, make a German short row on this end, and then knit back until we get to that German short row, make another one, and then come back and keep doing that and repeating until this middle section is going to get smaller and smaller and smaller as we create more short rows on either side of this shape here. And then we'll just have this section in the middle. So basically what's going to happen is your stitches will be pretty much divided into thirds, and the third in the center will remain unworked. You won't have any short rows right here in the center. You won't have any double stitches, which is what we'll refer to these stitches that we're creating, these German short rows. And you'll have a bunch of little short rows, double stitches over here, and a bunch of them on this side, and then about a third in the middle that won't have any. So we just keep working back and forth, making shorter and shorter rows until we get that round shape that we want. So we're going to turn our work, because we're working back and forth in rows right now. So our first double stitch is on our wrong side row. So what we do is we're going to slide my stitches up. The yarn's in the front. I'm going to be purling, but we also need it in the front to create our double stitch. What we do is slip purlwise. We're going to slip that first stitch to our right needle, and then we need to bring the yarn up and over. And what that does is it brings up both legs of the stitch, and that's what we refer to as a double stitch. It's the same one stitch, but we're seeing both legs of it. Then we need to bring it back to the front, sort of like we made a yarn over, but we want to get it in position to purl. So you're just going to purl to the end of this needle. So I've reached the end. I'm going to turn and going to work row 2. So we're going to work our double stitch on this end. You can see the first one is over here. That stitch has been pulled up, and it's that little stitch right there on the end. This one right here. We're going to do the same thing on this side, but we are going to be knitting, but for a double stitch to create that short row, we have to bring the yarn to the front, slip that first stitch where the yarn's attached to our right needle, and then we pull it up and over. And that creates the double stitch. And we want to knit, so we're just going to bring that yarn to the back of the work. And we're going to knit to the end, not including that double stitch. We're going to knit right up to that double stitch, and then we're going to stop. Now I'm coming up right to the end. I don't want to work that double stitch yet. So you can see it's right there. I'm going to stop. So I've worked my double stitch, I've knit to the end, I stop when I came to this one. It's going to stay on this left needle. Now I'm going to turn my work and we're going to make another double stitch. So this first stitch that has the yarn attached, we're going to slip it purlwise, bring the yarn up and over. That creates the double stitch. Now to purl, we need to bring the yarn back around to the front, around that needle. Then we can just purl. We're going to purl until we get to that double stitch on the other side, and we're not going to work that double stitch. We're going to leave it on our left needle. So I'm coming up to that double stitch on this side, and I'm going to stop when I get to it and leave it on the left needle, and I'm going to turn. Now I'm going to make another double stitch. I'm working row 2 again. We're going to keep repeating row 2 and 3 until we have all of our stitches worked that need to be worked. So we bring the yarn to the front, we slip that stitch, the yarn's attached to it, bring it up and over, that creates the double stitch, and we need to knit, so we're just going to bring it to the back. And we're going to knit across this row until we get to the double stitch that's closest to us on this side. Coming up to those double stitches, so I'm going to stop when I get to them, and I can see them, they're right there. They look different than the other stitches. Then I stop, turn my work. The yarn's already in the front because we're going to purl. We slip that stitch, bring the yarn up and over to create the double stitch, and then back between the needles to the front so we can purl. And that's all we're going to be doing, is working back and forth, working one less stitch on each side, because we're turning those stitches into our short row stitches, our double stitches. So we're going to continue doing this until the pattern will tell you how many stitches you should have remaining in the center that are not worked yet. Okay, so I finished that second, or row 3 again. This is where we're at right now. We're slowly creating those short rows. We've got 2 on this side. I've got 3 over here. I'm about to create my third one on this side. So it always is going to seem like we have 1 extra over here or 1 less worked on this side, because our last one will be worked in the very next section. So you're just going to keep repeating that. I'm on this end now, so I'll make another double stitch. I'll knit till I get to the double stitches over here. I'll make another double stitch and I'll knit till I purl till I get over here, and it'll get shorter and shorter and shorter. I'll show you after I finish all of my short rows. But the pattern will tell you that you repeat that a certain number of times until you have a certain number of stitches that are left unworked in the center. You'll have a bunch of short rows over here and a bunch over here, and then in my case I will have 13 heel stitches in the middle that will still be unworked. I'll have 12 double stitches over here, and I'll have 11 on this side because I'll have 1 more that I'll have to finish on the next section. So you're just going to keep making those double stitches back and forth, following the pattern until you have repeated that enough, until you have a certain number of stitches remaining in the middle. In my case, that's 13 heel stitches. But the pattern spells that all out. It will tell you how many stitches you should have here and how many stitches you should have on this side, and then how many stitches you'll have left in the middle. So I finished making all of my short rows. So we have 11 of them over here, and on this needle we have 12 of them, and there are 13 stitches left in the middle. I have 1 more that I need to work, so I have an equal amount on both sides, but I'm going to work that on the next round when we start our heel flap. So after you finish your last wrong side row, this is what things will look like. You've got some of your short rows over here and some over here, and all of your heel stitches are right there on that left needle. And I forgot we're going to need another stitch marker at this point. So from here, we're going to create that last short row. Then we're also going to create our heel flap, and we're going to be working decreases at each edge to get rid of those gusset stitches while we're creating. We're working back and forth just on the heel stitches again, but decreasing our gusset stitches at each side at the same time to get back to our stitch count again. or I should say to get back to our regular stitch count. Like in my case, I had 72 stitches, or I've got like 100 stitches right now, and I want to get back down to that 72. So right now, because we're going to be using up those gusset stitches, we want to get them moved back over to these needles. So what I'm going to do is this extra marker I grabbed, I'm going to slide that on there. We want to keep our heel stitches separate from our gusset stitches, and then I'm just going to slip them on the needle with these short row stitches that I have here. Once I get to this marker, I'm all done. I know the rest of these are instep stitches, so I'm just going to leave them there. I'm going to repeat that on this side too, and get all of our gusset stitches moved over so they're with these heel stitches, and we can start working our heel flap. So I'm just going to slip these gusset stitches over. Okay, and I made it to the marker. I can take that marker off. I don't need it anymore. We're just going to leave our instep stitches hanging out on these two needles. So now we've got everything we need to work our heel flap on these two needles. So we're going to keep working back and forth on these two needles to create that heel flap. Now also, this pattern, I'm just working this in plain stockinette stitch. Now if you want to do sort of like maybe an eye of partridge or some kind of a slip stitch pattern, you can certainly include that here while you're working across. We're just going to be working back and forth in stockinette and decreasing a stitch at each side to get rid of our gusset stitches. Now as we're working across on these first rows too, we are going to create our last double stitch, and then we're also going to work all of our double stitches as one stitch. It's sort of like making a knit two together. You're just going to take both legs of the stitch and work them together as one stitch. Okay, so on our first row, we're still working back and forth. We have our last double stitch to create. I'm going to move that yarn to the front and then make that final double stitch. So now I have the same number of double stitches on both sides of my heel. And I'm just going to work to one stitch before this marker. So on this row, we're also going to be getting rid of those short rows, or the double stitches that we've created. So I'm going to knit across these center heel stitches. They're just plain knit stitches. And now I'm coming up to that first double stitch, and what I want to do is just knit both legs of that stitch together. Make sure I'm getting in there into both and knitting them together. That's it. That's how we're going to resolve these short rows that we made. Just knitting both legs together for each of them. So just work right across. We're just working both legs of that double stitch together till we get to this last one. The last one's a bit fiddly because we're going to be working it together with the next stitch. We're going to start decreasing our gusset stitches as well. Okay, so I'm one stitch before. Now what's going to happen here is we need to keep our markers there so we know which stitches are the heel and which are the gusset stitches. So we just have to take it out every single time and then put it back. So it's a bit tedious, but and you could try to count and keep track, but it's just, I think it's easier to use a marker. So I have a note in the pattern that tells you that you have to remove the marker and replace it every time. So we're going to work an SSK on this side. So I'm going to slip this double stitch like it's an SSK. I'm going to take that marker out, slip this next stitch knitwise, and then knit them together through the back loop. And now we're going to turn and work back in the other direction, but I want to keep those stitches separated. So I'm going to put that marker back on there. So the yarn's in the front. We're going to slip this stitch purlwise and then purl to the marker. So we have our other double stitches on the other side we have to resolve as well. So we're going to purl both legs of those double stitches together. Okay, I'm coming up to the double stitches now. One more stitch to purl. So there is that double stitch. I'm just going to insert into the both both legs of it can be a bit finicky. Okay, and then we're just going to purl it together as one stitch. You're going to do that for each of these. So there's nothing special about resolving your short rows, you're just purling it together. Sometimes it can be a bit tight, so I like to slide it right up to the tip of my needle. Try to make sure I'm getting both legs. Okay, so I'm on my last stitch before, so I'm going to just slip it over to the other needle, making sure I'm getting into both legs under there. I'm going to remove my marker. And slip it back and purl it together with that first gusset stitch. Now I'm going to turn and I'm going to place that marker back on there again. Okay, so I'm going to, at this point, slip with the yarn in the back, that stitch that we just created, and knit to one stitch before the marker. So we've resolved all of our short rows, and now it's just a matter of slipping the first stitch. We're holding the yarn to the wrong side when we slip the stitch, and then working our decrease. And we're going to keep doing this until we have one stitch remaining on either side, one gusset stitch. We're just going to keep working back and forth, decreasing our stitches till we have one left. And then when we have one left on either side, we'll resolve those as we continue knitting in the round again. But for now, we're just going to knit back and forth in rows. I'm almost to my marker, so one stitch before. So I'm going to slip it as if to knit, since I know I'm going to be making an SSK. Take that marker out, slip the next one as if to knit, and work my SSK. And then I turn, put that marker back on there, and we're going to slip this first stitch with the yarn held to the front, and then purl to one stitch before the next marker. So we're one stitch before the marker. I'm just going to slip it purl-wise because we're going to be working our purl two together, and slip it back, purl it together with that gusset stitch, turn my work, put that marker back on there, and slip this first stitch with the yarn in the back and knit to the marker. So now we are just going to continue repeating this, slipping the first stitch after that decrease, working back and forth on these two needles, removing our marker and decreasing away a gusset stitch on each side. You're going to continue doing this until there's one gusset stitch left on either side. So I've used up all of the gusset stitches. I have one left on either side of the marker. So now we're going to start knitting in the round again. So back here is our beginning of round, and we want to get back over there, but I'm going to just move my marker up a little bit so I know where my beginning of round is. And we'll get back to our original beginning of round and get all of these final gusset stitches removed. Okay, so no more working back and forth. We're going to start working in the round again. So I still have one stitch over here. I'm just going to leave it there. So slipping this stitch with the yarn in the back, that was the last decrease I just finished. I'm going to knit to that one stitch before the marker, and we'll get rid of that last gusset stitch on that side. So I'm one stitch before. I'm going to slip that knitwise, so I'm preparing for my SSK. Slip that one knitwise and then knit them together through the back. Now I'm all done with that one. I'm going to continue knitting in the round. I'm going to work pretty firmly right here on this first stitch to see if we can close up any potential gap. On the next round, if there's still a gap there, we'll pick up a stitch and try to tighten things up a little bit. So there's the first half of our instep stitches. And we'll continue knitting our instep stitches here. Okay, and now we're back to our last gusset stitch here, and we're going to work a knit two together. So we need to slip one out of the way so we can remove that marker, slip it back, and we'll knit two together. Now we should be back down to our original stitch count, and I'm going to just knit to the end of this needle, and we'll be back at the beginning of the round. Then at that point, it's just knitting the leg, and we can check to see if we have a gap that we want to deal with, and we can pick up the running thread in between and tighten things up, and then just knit the leg as long as you want it to be. One of the nice things about working toe up is that you can use up every last little bit of yarn. Just keep knitting until you have used up, well, half your skein, because you want the other half for your other sock. But I prefer shorty socks, so I think I did about 5 rounds after finishing this part. So I'm 1 stitch from my back to the beginning of round, and it does look a little loose right here. So to close this up, I'm going to slip this last stitch knitwise. And then I'm going to use the tip of this needle. So I'm going to go, and then we see like that final decrease we worked. I want to go to the stitch underneath that one. I'm going to pick up the leg of that stitch, put that on the needle, and then I'm going to insert and knit both of them through the back loop. And hopefully that will close up our gap right there. There, we can check that. That looks a lot better. So I just want to try to remember to work firmly right here to make sure we're closing up any more potential gaps right there. And we're going to do the same on the other side. So I'm pulling that one more tightly. Okay, so we're back on this side, and we want to do the same over here. Drop that one for now. So this is the stitch we just worked, and there's pretty loose. We're going to go to the one underneath that, actually. The stitch underneath, and lift it by its leg. So we've got that, and that first stitch on our heel, we're just going to knit it together. And it's still, well, this stitch looks pretty loose, so I'm going to pull it up on the yarn, and there we go, and we can close that. We can tighten that stitch up by just moving some of that excess yarn over. And I can do this again later after I finished a few more rounds. But that should hopefully close up any holes. So you can either pick up like the running bar between those stitches and knit it together, or I like to pick up the leg of the actual stitch. That's a few rows down, and just knit it together with that stitch. So at this point, we're just going to continue knitting. I should start with my other needle. And continue knitting for the length of the sock, and to avoid any ladders or holes, we just work a little more firmly in that position and holding our needle underneath this needle. That seems to help me, at least, to avoid getting any ladders in that position. So just keep knitting the leg until it's as long as you want, and then we're going to come back and we'll get started on the cuff. So I've worked a few rounds in stockinette, and I'm ready to start the cuff, but before I do, I'm just going to check those spots where I made those decreases, where my gusset and heel meets the instep. So I'm just going to check, and if there's something loose there, I can use the tip of my needle and move some of that excess yarn over, because at this point we don't want any holes there, but sometimes it's just because there's loose stitches. So we're just going to move the yarn over stitch by stitch until we can sort of like just incorporate it into the stitches on either side. There. And I'm just going to check that side looks fine now. I'll do the same over here. You just want to do this after you've knit enough rounds to really get a good idea of what it looks like. And I've got a few large stitches here. So I'm going to pull up on that stitch and then move it, some of that excess yarn over, away from where that instep meets the heel and gusset stitches, that, well, the heel flap there. And this one had quite a bit of excess yarn, so I'm going to work it over further away, and then I can sort of like let it just, some of that slack go into these stitches, and it'll even out, especially after I get it washed and blocked. I just want to deal with it now so those stitches don't stay large and that yarn sort of gets used to being in that position. There. And I'll come back and see if I want to adjust any more. This one right here, I'm going to see if I can pull up some of that slack. It looks a bit loose right there, so see if we can move some of that over this way. And that's all I do. I don't really, there's no holes here. We've closed up anything that could be holes, but it might just be loose right there. So what I do at this point is just come in and move some of that excess yarn away from that area and just move it over to these stitches where it can sort of be redistributed. And it won't look so bad there. There, that looks a lot better. So now I'm ready to start with my cuff. We're just doing a knit one, purl one cuff. So at this point, our instep is divided between these two needles and our heel is all back here. So we're back at the beginning of round. And when the leg is as long as you want, you can just continue knitting until you have quite a long leg if you want. We're just going to switch to knit one, purl one, rib. So knit the first stitch, purl the next, and then just continue doing that around. And this first round will establish the pattern. And then you'll just continue following that knit one, purl one pattern until the cuff is as long as you want it to be. In the pattern, I have it listed as 2 inches. So do a 2-inch cuff in this knit one, purl one, rib. And then we'll come back and we're going to use Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off to give us a nice stretchy edge. You want a nice cuff that is going to have plenty of stretch so you can get it over your foot and your heel. So you don't really have to watch me do this knit one, purl one, rib. I'm going to do this all the way around. I start with a knit stitch, I will end with a purl, and then that pattern is established and I can keep working in knit one, purl one, rib until the cuff is as long as I want it to be. And in the pattern, the case for this pattern, that is going to be 2 inches. But of course you can make it as long or as short as you want it. So we'll come back after I've worked my cuff and we will bind off. So I finished my few inches of the ribbing for the top of the sock and now it's time to bind off. So we are going to use a bind off called Jenny's Surprisingly Stretchy Bind Off. It uses a series of yarn overs to actually just add more space between each stitch so you get a very, very, very stretchy sock. It does have a tendency to sort of ruffle out at the top, but I'm going to demonstrate how to do it and then also offer some tips. If you find that it's sort of ruffling out and you don't like the effect, you can just perhaps work the yarn over on every other stitch, perhaps just every knit stitch or just every purl stitch, and then it won't be quite as stretchy if you find it stretching too much. I actually think it came out just fine. It's not ruffling out too much, but sometimes it does have a tendency to do that. If you look at it from the top, you can see it sort of has a wavy effect because of all of those extra yarn overs in there to make it very stretchy. So to get started, we're going to just knit the first stitch and then we'll start the repeat for the pattern. So whenever there's a yarn over or a purl stitch, the next stitch we're just going to yarn over, just a basic yarn over, and then purl one. And then basically we want to pull these 2 stitches, the yarn over we just created and that knit stitch over the purl stitch. Now you can either do them both at the same time. Sometimes, like especially where it's the first few stitches, they might be a bit tight, so I'm going to just try to do one at a time because we don't want to lose our purl stitch there. So we're just going to bind off those first 2. There's the yarn over and there is that knit stitch. And then the next step is what happens before a knit stitch. If the next stitch is a knit stitch, then we do a reverse yarn over. We bring the yarn from the back to the front and then we knit that stitch. And then we pull that yarn over and that first stitch over the just knit stitch. And that's really the whole repeat. Our next stitch is a purl stitch, so we're going to yarn over and then purl and then pull both of those stitches over. Now I think I can probably grab them both, pull them both over that purl stitch. And then we have a knit stitch, so it's a reverse yarn over from back to front. Knit that stitch, pull both of those stitches over our just knit stitch, and then you're just going to repeat that. So the only thing you're doing is adding that yarn over in between. So our next stitch is a purl stitch, so it's a normal yarn over and a purl, and then bind that off. And then we have a knit stitch next, so it's a reverse yarn over, and then knit and pull them both over. And you're just going to keep doing this until you come to your very last stitch. And you'll just break the yarn and pull it through your final stitch after you've bound off those stitches. So I'm just going to continue binding off, adding that yarn over in between until I've finished. Now, if you have issues with this bind off and you don't like how it ruffles so much at the top, then what you can do is just put in fewer yarn overs. Perhaps you could just work the yarn overs just before the knit stitches and not before the purl stitches, or the reverse, work them just before the purl stitches and not the knit stitches, and that'll cut them in half basically. So it would be slightly less stretchy, but it wouldn't ruffle out. If you have an issue where it starts to ruffle out at the top and you don't like the way it does that, then just work fewer yarn overs. You don't have to work them before every stitch, but I did on my first sock, and I'm going to on this one because I think it looks all right for this, and I want plenty of stretch in that cuff. You really don't want to bind off tightly at all when you're working a sock. You want that cuff to be able to stretch to go over the heel and the instep, but still have enough elasticity to pull or to stay in place when it's on the foot, on the leg itself. So I'm just going to keep knitting until we're done, and then we just have to weave in our ends. So I've finished with this needle, so I can just drop that needle and continue on with the next one. Okay, so we're on our last stitch. Just going to cut the yarn, leaving a tail. And I'll just pull it through. That final loop, make sure everything's secured. And now we can weave in our ends. I like to use the bent needles for this. I just find it a little bit easier to use. So for the cuff, we want to fix where it's sort of like, because we've been knitting like sort of in this circle, but it's offset. You can see it's much higher here. We want to come into this stitch next to it under both legs of that bound off stitch, and then come back down into the back leg of that stitch. And that sort of closes things up. Still a little bit high, but it's not too bad. And then that sort of closes up that gap. And then we can go to the inside, and when I have ribbing on here, I just like to take my yarn tail and run it up the leg of one side right here. So we're just going to go up the legs of this stitch, this column of stitches. And you can't see it on the front. It's hidden in basically the purl ditch on this side. So I like to go all the way up that whole column. I don't go under every single leg, but most of them up this side till I get to the very top where we've switched to stockinette stitch, and then I sort of bring it around under this stitch here. Make sure it's not going to be seen from the front. That one might be, so I'm going to not put that right there. And look around and see where I can come through where it's not going to be noticeable on the front. So we'll go just like this, just around these stitches here. Yep, I don't see anything there. And then I'm going to run it back up the next column. I'm going to go over one column and sort of run it up a few stitches here. I'm not going to go, maybe halfway. That's good enough. And I'll stop right there and trim that. So that is the yarn tail for the cuff. So we've closed up that gap. We've got it all woven in. Now for the toe. I like to pull this one to the inside, and then you can use it to close up any holes that you have. Where we did our closed cast on, I'd like to bring it right into the center of that hole to the inside, and then turn the socket right side out, and we can take off any markers we have left here. And I want to get rid of that hole that we have right at the bottom. So I'm just going to take my needle and run it around the stitches around the outside, sort of closing up this hole. There. And when I feel like it's closed up, I'm going to give it a little tug, and then I'm just going to pick one of those columns of increases where we worked these yarn overs, and just sort of like we did with the ribbing, I'm just going to run it right up that column of stitches. And then maybe through a few stitches right here, just to do a little bit of duplicate stitch to hold it in place, and then snip the tail, and that should be plenty to hold that in place. Then, well, before I snipped it, I should have checked to make sure everything was closed up, but that looks really good. I closed up that hole. Our ends are woven in. Now I can just give this a good wash in a block, and it'll be ready to wear. Now that you've finished your first sock, it's time to cast on and knit that second sock. And if you want to watch some videos specific to sock knitting, about caring for them, finding the proper fit, and lots of other things, I put together a playlist right here, so you can click through and watch the next video while you're working on that second sock. I'll see you in the next video.